She was preparing a romantic surprise for her husband, but accidentally overheard a conversation that ruined everything. Subscribe, watch other videos, and write in the comments where you're from. Aisha stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the delicate lace of her wedding dress. The intricate floral patterns of the fabric shimmered under the soft glow of the bedroom lights, casting a dreamlike aura around her. She had imagined this day countless times before, ever since she was a little girl, twirling in front of the mirror in her mother's old dresses, dreaming of the man who would one day look at her as if she was his whole world. But today, as she stood on the cusp of a new life, a quiet unease settled in her chest, pressing down like a weight she couldn't quite shake. She reached out, running her fingers along the smooth, polished surface of the vanity. A pair of pearl earrings sat neatly beside a silver hairbrush, her something borrowed from her late mother. A dull ache throbbed in her chest at the thought of her parents. They should have been here today. Her father should have been waiting outside, ready to walk her down the aisle with that proud, steady presence that had made her feel safe all her life. Her mother should have been fussing over the final details, dabbing away happy tears with a silk handkerchief. Instead, they were gone. Aisha had been only 24 when the accident happened, a tragic car crash that had taken both of them in an instant, leaving her to navigate the world alone. In the years since, she had learned how to survive, how to build a life from the ashes of grief. And she had done it, on her own terms. She was proud of what she had accomplished. She had worked hard, built a career, carved out a place for herself in a world that hadn't always been welcoming to her. And now she was getting married, to a man she loved, a man who had promised to stand beside her no matter what. Todd had been her anchor in ways she hadn't realized she needed. They had met at work. He, a rising executive in the company's finance department, and she, an ambitious marketing strategist. Their connection had been instant. He had a natural charm, an easy confidence that made people gravitate toward him, and he had made her feel seen, truly seen. In the beginning, Aisha had been hesitant. Todd came from a different world, a wealthy, conservative white family with deep ties to old money traditions. She knew what relationships like theirs faced, but Todd had assured her that none of that mattered, that love was enough. Still, there had been moments, small, fleeting moments, when Aisha had questioned how deep that love ran. His family had never been openly hostile, but there had always been an undercurrent of tension, a quiet disapproval lurking beneath polite smiles. His mother, Eleanor, was a woman of impeccable poise, always dressed in elegant neutrals, her words measured and deliberate. She had never outright dismissed Aisha, but her approval had been given with a distinct sense of reservation, as if she were waiting for Aisha to prove herself. Aisha had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that time would soften their stance, that today, on her wedding day, all of that would fade away. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over her dress, willing herself to focus on the good. There was so much good. Todd loved her. That was what mattered. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 30 minutes. In 30 minutes she would walk down the aisle and say, "I do." A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called softly, expecting her maid of honor. Instead, the door creaked open to reveal Eleanor. Aisha straightened automatically, her smile polite but guarded. "You look lovely," Eleanor said, stepping into the room with that same composed grace. "Truly stunning." "Thank you," Aisha replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then Eleanor sighed, her eyes sweeping over Aisha's dress. "I just wanted to say that I know today is a big day for you," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "And for Todd. This is a significant moment in his life." Aisha frowned slightly at the phrasing, but kept her expression neutral. "I just hope you understand the responsibility that comes with a marriage like this," Eleanor continued, folding her hands in front of her. He comes from a family with certain expectations, certain traditions, and, well, sometimes love isn't enough to overcome those things." Aisha felt her stomach tighten. "I'm not sure I understand what you're saying," she said slowly. Eleanor gave her a small, tight smile. "I'm saying that life is complicated, dear, and sometimes when things get hard, when the initial excitement fades, people start to question what they really want, what truly fits." Aisha's pulse quickened. "Are you suggesting that Todd will regret this?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Eleanor held her gaze for a long moment before finally shaking her head. "I'm suggesting that you prepare yourself for the reality of what comes after today." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before she stepped out. "I do hope you prove me wrong," she murmured before slipping away, leaving Aisha standing there, cold dread creeping through her veins. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. This was just another test, another moment where she had to prove herself. And she would. She had given up too much, sacrificed too much, to let doubt creep in now. She was going to marry Todd. She was going to be happy, even if, deep down, a small, quiet part of her wasn't so sure anymore. The ceremony was perfect. At least, that's what everyone kept telling her. The setting was breathtaking. An expansive estate in the countryside, with lush gardens and towering oak trees that had stood for generations. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting golden hues across the gathered guests, all dressed in their finest. Aisha should have felt like the luckiest woman in the world, standing beneath the floral arch, Todd's hands in hers, his blue eyes full of warmth as he recited his vows. And yet, as she looked around, she felt a deep, unsettling distance from everything happening around her. This wasn't her wedding. It was Todd's. It was his family's. It was their tradition, their idea of what a perfect day should be. Nothing about the day had been tailored to her. The venue, chosen by Eleanor, the food, a high-end, European-inspired menu that had nothing to do with the Southern comfort dishes she had grown up with. The music, a classical string quartet, elegant but lifeless to her ears. Even her wedding dress, though stunning, had been gently nudged upon her by a designer Eleanor had personally recommended. Her vision for a smaller, more intimate ceremony had been swept aside almost immediately, dismissed as not practical for Todd's circle. It wasn't that she hadn't tried to push back, she had. But every time she did, she was met with a kind but firm reminder that this was simply how things were done in their family. Todd had reassured her at every step. "It's just one day," he had said more times than she could count. "Don't stress about it, babe. What matters is us, not the details." But as she looked around now, surrounded by a sea of unfamiliar white faces, she wondered if that was really true. Her own guest list was painfully short. Her parents were gone. Her extended family, though loving, had mostly been unable to attend, whether due to distance, finances, or quiet disapproval of her choice. Her two closest friends, Nina and Marcus, had made it, and she was grateful for their presence, but she saw the discomfort in their eyes as they sat among Todd's relatives, the only black faces in a crowd of polished aristocrats. They had warned her. Nina, in particular, had sat her down weeks before the wedding, gently asking if she was really sure about this. "It's not just about Todd," she had said carefully. "It's about the world he comes from. Are you ready to live in it?" Aisha had told her she was. That love would bridge the gaps, that Todd was different. Now, standing at the altar, she wasn't so sure. The officiant's voice pulled her back to the moment. "Do you, Aisha Nicole Reed, take Todd Harrison Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded husband?" A brief silence. Too brief for anyone else to notice, but long enough for Aisha to feel the weight of it. Then she smiled, just as she had practiced, and said the words that were expected of her. "I do." Applause, cheers, the murmurs of approval from the guests. The official kiss came next, a brief, careful moment, just enough for the cameras before Todd pulled back with a boyish grin. "She's officially stuck with me now," he joked, prompting laughter from the crowd. Aisha smiled, but the knot in her stomach tightened. The reception was lavish, held under an enormous white tent draped with twinkling fairy lights. Long banquet tables stretched across the space, covered in fine china and pristine floral arrangements. The entire event felt like something out of a luxury wedding magazine, flawless, expensive, and entirely foreign to her. The guests were enjoying themselves, that much was clear. Todd's family and friends mingled effortlessly, sipping champagne and exchanging polite conversation. Aisha, meanwhile, found herself drifting from one carefully curated moment to the next, playing the role of the happy bride while barely feeling present. She noticed early on how the conversations unfolded. People spoke to Todd with ease, laughing, sharing old stories, treating him like the golden boy they had always known. With Aisha, the tone was different. Polite, always polite, but distant. Measured. They asked about her job, her background, her interests, but the questions felt like an interview rather than genuine curiosity. A few well-meaning guests offered backhanded compliments. How articulate she was, how poised. One woman even mentioned how lucky Todd was to have found someone so exotic and sophisticated. Aisha swallowed the responses she wanted to give. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. Still, it was hard not to notice the subtle but constant reminder that she was an outsider here. The wedding games began soon after dinner. The groomsmen had planned a series of fun challenges for Todd, obstacles he had to overcome to win his bride. It was a tradition, they explained, passed down in their social circle for generations. At first, it seemed harmless enough. They made Todd answer a list of questions about Aisha, perform a few silly dares. Then, one of the groomsmen, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Spencer, grinned and turned to Todd. "All right, last challenge. You have to prove you can handle a little culture shock." Aisha stiffened. "Oh, come on," another groomsman laughed. "It's tradition. The groom has to show he's willing to adapt to his wife's world." She had no idea what was coming next, but she already hated it. "Let's see if Todd can dance to a little hip-hop," Spencer continued, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his playlist. Nothing too crazy, just, something from Aisha's side of things. Aisha's stomach turned. The music started. A bass-heavy rap song, one of the most stereotypical choices they could have made. The groomsmen erupted in laughter as Todd awkwardly tried to move to the beat, exaggerating his steps, hamming it up for the crowd. People clapped, cheered, encouraged him to keep going. Aisha felt her cheeks burn. She caught Nina's gaze from across the room. Her friend's expression was unreadable, but Aisha knew exactly what she was thinking. This isn't funny. This isn't harmless. And yet she was expected to laugh, to go along with it, to be a good sport. She forced a smile, clapping lightly along with the others, even as something inside her twisted. Todd finished his performance with a dramatic bow, grinning as he sat back down beside her. "See?" he said, leaning in. "I told you I'm all in." She didn't answer. By the time the reception started winding down, Aisha was exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally. She had done everything right, smiled in all the right places, laughed at all the jokes, posed for every carefully staged photo. But this wasn't her wedding. It never had been. It was a show, a carefully orchestrated display of acceptance, of open-mindedness, of progressiveness. And she was the proof. Aisha excused herself, retreating to the bridal suite for a few moments of quiet. She needed to breathe, to collect herself before the final stretch of the evening. As she reached the door, she overheard a hushed conversation just inside. "She's pretty, I'll give her that," a woman's voice said. "I suppose," another voice replied, "but let's be honest, this was never about love." A sharp laugh. "Of course not. It's about optics. Todd's got ambitions. Marrying a black woman? It makes him look progressive. Good for business, good for politics. And she's got money, so it's a win-win." Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She felt like the ground beneath her had just crumbled. She wasn't just an outsider here. She was an asset, a strategy. She wasn't a bride. She was a statement. Aisha stood frozen outside the bridal suite, her breath caught in her throat as the voices inside continued their hushed conversation. "She has no idea, does she?" One of the women chuckled softly. "No," the other replied with a sigh. "Poor thing probably thinks this is some fairy tale romance." Aisha's stomach churned. She should have walked away, should have pushed open the door and confronted them, but she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she stood there, rooted in place, as the weight of their words pressed down on her. It wasn't about love. It was about optics. It was about her money. The air felt thick, suffocating. A wave of nausea rolled through her. She had spent months telling herself that she belonged here, that Todd's love was real, that his family's quiet reservations were simply a matter of time and adjustment. But now she wasn't so sure. With trembling fingers, she smoothed the fabric of her white pantsuit, the backup outfit she'd been forced to change into after the earlier mishap with her gown. The moment had been brushed off as an accident, an unfortunate slip in the chaos of the wedding procession. But now, with everything else piling onto her chest, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought at the back of her mind. Was it really an accident? She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to take control of her emotions. This wasn't the time to break down. She would handle this later. She had to. Pasting on a smile she no longer felt, she stepped into the room. The two women, Todd's cousin Lillian and a friend of the family she barely knew, jumped at her sudden appearance. Their expressions twisted in surprise, then smoothed into polite indifference, as if they hadn't just been tearing her world apart in whispers. "Oh, Aisha," Lillian said, a little too brightly. "We were just talking about how stunning you look tonight." Aisha's lips barely moved as she replied, "Thanks." Neither of them met her gaze. She wanted to confront them. She wanted to demand answers. But what would they say? They were just joking? That she misunderstood? No, not here, not now. Instead, she turned on her heel and left, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time she rejoined the reception, the energy in the tent had shifted. The initial formality of the evening had melted away, replaced with the rowdy, tipsy enthusiasm that followed hours of expensive champagne and carefully curated entertainment. The dance floor was packed. The band had switched to livelier music, and guests moved in a blur of silk, chiffon, and tuxedos. Laughter echoed from the bar area, where Todd stood among his groomsmen, his tie loosened, a drink in hand. He was grinning, at ease in a way Aisha hadn't seen him all night. For a fleeting second, she considered telling him everything. What she had overheard, what she was feeling, how the walls of this carefully constructed illusion were starting to crack. But then, as if sensing her gaze, Todd turned to her, his face lighting up. "There's my wife," he called, holding up his drink in a mock toast. "Finally done hiding?" Aisha's jaw tightened. She forced herself to smile. She wasn't hiding. She was drowning. Dinner had been a carefully orchestrated performance. Every course had been selected weeks in advance, chosen to cater to Todd's family's refined tastes. There was no mention of the southern dishes Aisha had suggested adding to the menu. No cornbread, no mac and cheese, no nod to the flavors she had grown up with. "Just trust me," Eleanor had said when they had finalized the catering. "It's best to keep things elegant." Elegant, as if her culture wasn't. She had let it go at the time, just like she had let so many things go. But now, seated at the long banquet table, she pushed her food around her plate, her appetite gone. A waiter passed behind her, refilling wine glasses. "She barely touched her plate," someone murmured from a few seats away. "Well," another voice responded, amused, "guess it's an acquired taste." Aisha's grip tightened on her fork. Not tonight. Not here. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her expression neutral. She had become an expert at it by now, but Nina, seated beside her, wasn't so restrained. "You good?" her friend asked under her breath. Aisha nodded once. "Fine." Nina studied her, unconvinced. Aisha could feel it, that unspoken challenge in her friend's gaze. A silent reminder that she didn't have to sit here and take this. But she did. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Todd. About the life they were supposed to build. And wasn't that worth a little discomfort? The night carried on. There were more speeches, more forced laughter, more polite interactions that felt like a balancing act. And then came the moment that nearly broke her. She had excused herself to the powder room, hoping for a moment of solitude, when she overheard another conversation, this time between Todd's uncle and an older business associate. "I have to say," the man chuckled, "when I heard Todd was marrying a black woman, I thought Eleanor had finally lost control of him." Todd's uncle laughed in response. "Please, he knows exactly what he's doing." A long pause. "Well, I suppose it's good PR," the man mused. "Shows he's progressive. Helps in the business world, too. Clients love that kind of thing these days." Aisha felt the blood drain from her face. Good PR. That's what she was to them. Not a wife, not a partner, a strategy. She barely remembered the rest of the reception. The toasts blurred together, the final dance passed in a haze. At some point, Todd pulled her aside, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We did it," he murmured. "Wasn't so bad, right?" She nodded, but the words felt like a lie, because something inside her had shifted, and for the first time she wasn't sure she had made the right choice. Aisha woke the next morning with a dull ache behind her eyes. The wedding had been over for only a few hours, but already it felt like a distant memory, one she wanted to push as far away from her mind as possible. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of the honeymoon suite, the soft white sheets tangled around her legs. The room smelled like roses and expensive cologne, remnants of the previous night's carefully curated perfection. Beside her, Todd was still asleep, his face relaxed in the dim morning light. She should have felt happy, or relieved, or something. Instead, all she felt was exhaustion. She rolled onto her side, watching him for a moment. His face was familiar, comforting even, but for the first time since she had met him, she felt like she didn't really know him at all. The conversations she had overheard during the reception replayed in her mind. The quiet voices, the dismissive laughter, the casual way people had spoken about her as if she weren't a person at all, just an image to be managed, a strategic move in Todd's life. She wanted to believe none of it was true, but the silence in Todd's response to everything last night spoke louder than any whispered conversation. A small part of her had expected him to notice, to see the way she had withdrawn as the night went on, to sense the shift in her mood. But he hadn't, because to him nothing had changed. He had been glowing all night, the center of attention, basking in the approval of his family, his friends, his world. He had been happy, because as far as he was concerned, the wedding had been a success. Aisha exhaled slowly and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. The honeymoon suite was luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the rolling hills of the estate. A bottle of untouched champagne sat in a silver bucket near the fireplace, next to the remnants of last night's dessert tray. She padded across the room, wrapping one of the plush robes around her shoulders before settling into the armchair by the window. Outside, the world was still waking up. Servants from the estate moved quietly across the manicured grounds, clearing away the last traces of the wedding. The reception tent was still standing, its white fabric billowing gently in the breeze. The sight of it made her stomach turn. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She glanced back at Todd, who stirred slightly but didn't wake. Another knock. She hesitated, then crossed the room and opened the door. Eleanor stood on the other side, perfectly put together despite the early hour, her dark cashmere coat draped elegantly over her shoulders. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Eleanor smiled, a polite, distant thing. "Good morning, Aisha." Aisha tightened her grip on the doorknob. "Morning." "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Eleanor said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Aisha closed the door behind her, already bracing herself for whatever this was. Eleanor's gaze swept the room, taking in the details before finally settling back on Aisha. "I wanted to check in, make sure everything went smoothly last night." Aisha forced a small smile. "It was a beautiful wedding." Eleanor nodded, clearly pleased. "Yes, it was." Silence stretched between them. Then Eleanor sighed, as if preparing herself for something unpleasant. "Aisha," she said, her tone shifting slightly, "I know last night may have been overwhelming for you. Adjusting to our family, to our traditions, it's not always easy." Aisha said nothing. "I just want to remind you," Eleanor continued, "that as Todd's wife, you have a responsibility now." A cold feeling crept into Aisha's spine. A responsibility? Eleanor's smile didn't falter. To support him, to stand by him, to understand what this marriage means. Something inside Aisha snapped. "What this marriage means," she repeated, her voice colder than she intended. "I thought it meant we love each other." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Amusement, maybe, or pity. "Of course, dear, but love is only one part of it. Todd has ambitions. He has a future to build. And now, you're part of that." Aisha's pulse pounded in her ears. Eleanor continued, her voice smooth and practiced. "People will be watching you both, especially now. Your marriage, it's a symbol, a statement. Aisha clenched her jaw. I'm not a symbol. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if considering her. No, she said after a moment. You're an opportunity. Aisha felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Eleanor sighed again, adjusting the sleeve of her coat. I know this may be difficult to hear, but you're a smart woman. I know you'll find your place. She turned toward the door, pausing just before she left. Todd will need you to be strong, to understand that some things are bigger than just the two of you. Aisha didn't answer. Eleanor gave her one last polite smile. Enjoy the rest of your honeymoon. And then she was gone. Aisha stood in the silence of the room, her thoughts racing. An opportunity, a statement, a strategy. She pressed a hand to her forehead, exhaling shakily. Eleanor hadn't said anything explicitly cruel. There had been no direct insults, no outright hostility. But somehow it was worse. Because everything she had been said with the certainty of someone who believed it to be fact. This wasn't about love. It had never been. And deep down, Aisha knew, if she stayed, if she ignored the warnings screaming in the back of her mind, she would lose herself completely. She turned towards the bed, staring at Todd's sleeping form. She loved him. She did. But maybe love wasn't enough. Aisha had never been the type to ignore her instincts. Growing up, her mother had always told her, Baby, when something doesn't feel right, trust that feeling. It's your spirit warning you. But when it came to Todd, she had ignored every warning sign, every moment of doubt. She had convinced herself that love was enough to bridge the gap between them, that his family's coldness would thaw with time, that the unspoken but ever-present tension in his world was just something she had to endure. Now, standing in the middle of their honeymoon suite, with Eleanor's words still ringing in her ears, she wasn't so sure anymore. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to shake the suffocating feeling that had settled over her. Todd, blissfully unaware, had whisked her away for the carefully planned itinerary his family had arranged. Brunch at an exclusive vineyard, a private boat tour along the river, candlelit dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant. Everything was perfect. On the surface, at least. Todd held her hand, kissed her forehead, told her how happy he was. But beneath his affectionate gestures, Aisha felt something missing. She had felt it before. In fleeting moments, she had brushed aside. But now it was undeniable. He wasn't really seeing her, not in the way she wanted to be seen, not in the way someone who truly knew her would. She smiled. She laughed when she was supposed to, but the weight in her chest only grew heavier. And then everything unraveled. Their honeymoon wasn't supposed to start until the following morning, but Aisha had planned a surprise for Todd. A romantic dinner just for the two of them. It was something simple. A way to step away from the suffocating grandeur of their wedding and just be themselves for a night. She had spent the afternoon picking out everything. His favorite wine, a playlist of songs they had danced to in their apartment. A homemade meal she had secretly arranged with the hotel's private chef. For the first time all day, she felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, something real amidst the manufactured perfection of everything else. She was going to remind Todd who they were before all of this, but Todd didn't come back when he said he would, and when he finally did, he wasn't alone. Aisha had just finished setting the table when she heard the door open. She smiled, smoothing the silk robe she had changed into, ready to greet him with a playful tease about keeping his wife waiting. But before she could step out of the bedroom, she heard voices. Todd's and someone else's. She froze. Do you even realize what you almost did? Todd's voice was low, harsh. A woman sighed. Todd, it wasn't that big of a deal. Aisha's stomach clenched. She stepped closer to the door, careful not to make a sound. "Not a big deal," Todd hissed. "You almost ruined everything." A pause. Then the woman, whoever she was, let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, come on. Do you really think this marriage is going to last?" Aisha's breath hitched. Silence. Then Todd's voice, quieter now. "That's not the point." Aisha pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. The woman scoffed. "You know, you're really good at playing the devoted husband. I almost believe it myself sometimes." Todd didn't respond. The woman continued, her voice dripping with amusement. "So, tell me, do you even love her, or was this just about the money?" Aisha's entire body went numb. She felt like she had been plunged into ice water, her mind scrambling to make sense of what she was hearing. Todd didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, tired. "It's complicated." Aisha felt like the floor had just collapsed beneath her. Her fingers curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. "It's complicated. Not yes. Not, of course I love her. Not even I don't owe you an explanation. Just, it's complicated." The woman sighed. "Well, I hope it's worth it, because I wouldn't have done this for all the money in the world." Aisha didn't hear anything else. She turned and walked back into the bedroom, her entire body trembling. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the perfectly made sheets, at the untouched candles flickering on the nightstand. Her ears were ringing. She felt lightheaded, like she might be sick. She had spent months, years, convincing herself that this relationship was built on something real. That Todd wasn't like the others. That this wasn't just some performative act for his family, for his career, for the perfect optics. And yet, here she was, hearing the truth straight from his mouth. She had been bought, maybe not in the literal sense, but she had been chosen for a reason that had nothing to do with love. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't say anything at all. When Todd finally walked into the bedroom, his expression was the same as always, charming, relaxed, oblivious. She pretended to be asleep. She heard him sigh, felt the bed shift under his weight as he climbed in beside her. For a moment, she wondered if he felt it too. The shift, the undeniable fracture in whatever they had built together. She lay there, staring at the wall, her heart pounding. She could leave, right now. She could pack a bag, walk out the door, and never look back. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she stayed awake long after Todd's breathing had evened out beside her. Thinking, planning. Because this wasn't the end. Not yet, but soon. Aisha woke before dawn, her body stiff from lying in the same position for hours. The weight of what she had overheard the night before pressed against her chest like a boulder, making it hard to breathe. Todd slept soundly beside her, his breathing even, his expression peaceful. For a fleeting second, she almost envied him. The ease with which he could drift into sleep, unburdened, untroubled, as if nothing had changed. As if he hadn't unknowingly confirmed her worst fears. She slipped out of bed as quietly as possible, careful not to wake him. The hardwood floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she padded to the window. Outside, the estate was still cloaked in darkness, the faintest sliver of light creeping over the horizon. The vast, sprawling land belonged to Todd's family, passed down through generations, a symbol of wealth and legacy. It had always made her feel like an outsider, no matter how much she tried to fit in. Now, that feeling was undeniable. She hugged her arms around herself, replaying the words she had heard the night before. "It's complicated." That was all Todd had said when asked if he loved her. He hadn't denied it outright, hadn't confessed to using her, but his hesitation was enough. If he had truly loved her, there wouldn't have been hesitation. There wouldn't have been anything complicated about it. Love wasn't a calculation. Love wasn't a strategy. But to Todd, to his family, to the world they belonged to, love had always been secondary to ambition. Aisha had given up so much for him. She had turned down the job offer in another state, put aside her own plans, all because she believed in the life they were building together. She had told herself that his family's quiet disapproval didn't matter, that their polite but distant smiles weren't a reflection of how he felt about her. She had convinced herself that the wedding had been for both of them, even when every single detail had been curated to fit his world, not hers. She had ignored the uneasy feeling in her gut every time his mother looked at her with that unreadable expression, every time one of his friends made a careless, racially tinged joke that Todd laughed off as harmless. She had let herself believe in the version of him she wanted him to be, not the man he actually was. A rustling sound behind her made her shoulders tense. She turned slightly, watching as Todd stirred in bed, blinking groggily before stretching and running a hand through his hair. When he spotted her standing by the window, he smiled sleepily. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he murmured, his voice warm, affectionate, as if nothing had changed. Aisha swallowed, forcing herself to return the smile. "Morning." He patted the space beside him, his expression soft. "Come back to bed. It's too early to be up." For a moment, she almost did. Almost crawled back beneath the covers, tucked herself into the warmth of his embrace, pretended that everything was fine. But the thought of it made her stomach turn. She shook her head. "Couldn't sleep." Todd yawned, stretching again before propping himself up on one elbow. "Big day yesterday. I don't blame you." He smiled, that easy, boyish grin that had once made her weak in the knees. "Crazy to think we're officially married now, huh?" Aisha stared at him, searching his face for something. Remorse, guilt, hesitation, but there was nothing. Did he really not feel it? The shift, the weight of the truth pressing between them like an invisible wall. Or did he just assume she would never question it? She walked toward the dresser, pretending to straighten something that didn't need straightening. She needed a moment, a breath, anything to keep herself from snapping. "I heard you talking last night," she said finally, keeping her voice neutral. Todd frowned, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "With someone," she clarified, forcing herself to remain steady. "A woman." Todd blinked, clearly struggling to catch up. Then his expression cleared and he let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, that was just Kate." Aisha's pulse quickened. "Kate?" "Yeah, you remember Kate, right?" he said casually, shifting to sit up fully. "Old friend. She was at the wedding." Aisha clenched her hands into fists at her sides. Old friend. The way he said it so easily, as if she was supposed to brush aside everything she had heard, made her blood boil. "You told her our marriage was complicated." Todd's expression faltered just for a second. Then he sighed, scrubbing a hand down his face. "Aisha, come on, I was just venting. Weddings are stressful, and you know how Kate is. She likes to push buttons." She stared at him, waiting for him to give her something real, an apology, an explanation, anything, but instead he smiled as if that was the end of it, as if the entire conversation could be neatly tucked away with an excuse. "I didn't mean anything by it," he added. "You know I love you." The words rang hollow. Aisha felt something inside her harden, an unspoken decision settling into place. He didn't see it. He didn't see her. She had given him every opportunity to prove otherwise. had given him her heart, her trust, her life, and he had taken it for granted. She exhaled slowly, nodding. Okay. Todd's smile returned, relief flashing across his face as if he had just dodged a bullet. Good, he said, reaching for her hand. Now, come back to bed. We have the whole honeymoon ahead of us. Aisha let him pull her toward the bed, let him press a kiss to the inside of her wrist, but she didn't climb in beside him. She didn't tell him that she wasn't staying. Not yet. She had learned something valuable in the past 24 hours. Todd had built a world where she was supposed to play a role, where she was expected to accept the unspoken rules and be grateful for the position she had been given. But he had underestimated her. He thought she was trapped. He thought she would stay. And that was his biggest mistake. Aisha spent the next 24 hours playing the role Todd expected her to play. She let him hold her hand as they walked through the private beach resort his family had arranged for their honeymoon. She laughed at his jokes, let him take pictures of them to post online with captions about how lucky he was to have married the love of his life. She nodded and smiled through dinner as he talked about their future, about the house they would buy, the parties they would host, the children they would have one day. She played along, not because she believed in any of it, but because she knew now that she had to be careful. She had to be smart. Todd thought she was settling in, that she had accepted her place in his world, in his carefully designed life. He didn't see the way her mind was working, calculating, rearranging the pieces of the life she had thought she wanted. He didn't see the way her heart had already moved on, had already begun building something new, something just for herself. The final confirmation came that evening when Todd left his phone on the table while he went to the bathroom. She had never been the kind of woman who needed to check her partner's phone. She had trusted him, trusted that his love was real, that what they had was built on something stronger than convenience or ambition. But trust had been a mistake, and now she knew better. She didn't hesitate as she picked up the phone, her hands steady as she scrolled through his messages. She found Kate's name almost immediately. Kate. She bought it? Todd. Yeah, told you, she always overthinks things. But it's fine now. Kate. She's not stupid, Todd. You should be more careful. Todd. It doesn't matter. We're married. She's not going anywhere. Aisha stared at the screen, her chest tightening, her vision blurring. It doesn't matter. We're married. She's not going anywhere. She set the phone down carefully, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. When Todd returned, smiling like nothing had changed, she smiled back. She listened as he told her about the plans for the next day, about the golf outing his father had set up for him and the dinner with some of his family's business partners. She listened, and she nodded, and she pretended she wasn't already gone. That night, she waited until he was asleep before she packed her bag. She moved quietly, taking only what she needed, leaving behind the things that tied her to this place, to this marriage. The engagement ring sat on the nightstand, gleaming under the soft glow of the lamp. She didn't take it. It wasn't hers anymore. Maybe it never had been. She slipped out of the room, her heart pounding as she walked down the long, empty hallway. Every step felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream, through a life that no longer belonged to her. She passed the front desk without stopping, pushing through the doors into the warm night air. The cab she had called was already waiting, its headlights cutting through the darkness. She slid into the back seat, her hands clenched together in her lap. The driver glanced at her in the mirror. Where to? For the first time in a long time, she didn't hesitate. The airport. The car pulled away from the curb, the resort fading into the distance behind her. She watched it disappear, the weight in her chest slowly lifting with each passing mile. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Nina. "Nina, please tell me you're not actually going through with this." Aisha let out a breath, a small, almost disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. "Aisha, I'm already gone." She looked out the window, watching as the city lights grew brighter in the distance. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into places that were never meant for her, trying to prove her worth to people who would never truly see her, trying to make herself small enough, agreeable enough, palatable enough for a world that had only ever seen her as a symbol, a statement, a stepping stone. No more. She didn't know exactly what came next, but she knew one thing for certain. She was done being someone else's opportunity. Now, she was going to be her own. The airport was buzzing with life despite the early hour. Travelers rushed past in hurried steps, some dragging suitcases behind them, others cradling cups of coffee as they scanned departure boards. The distant hum of intercom announcements mixed with the chatter of strangers, blending into a background noise that felt oddly comforting. Aisha sat near her gate, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea she had barely touched. She was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't trapped in that exhaustion. It wasn't the suffocating kind that came from trying to mold herself into something that fit into Todd's world. This was different. This was the exhaustion of someone who had finally made a choice for herself. Her phone vibrated on the seat beside her. She glanced at the screen. Todd. She didn't answer. He had already called 6 times, left 3 voicemails, and sent a string of texts that started as confusion, shifted to concern, and then turned into barely restrained anger. She knew exactly how this would go. At first, he would act like he didn't understand. Then, he would try to talk her down, convince her she was overreacting. And when that didn't work, when he realized she was serious, he would get defensive. She could already hear his voice in her head. "Aisha, come on. We just got married. You can't just leave like this. We need to talk about this like adults." As if he had ever talked to her like an equal. The thing that struck her the most wasn't even the lies he had told. It was that he had been so sure she wouldn't leave, that he could keep pretending, keep feeding her just enough to make her stay, make her doubt herself, that she would do what was expected of her, as she always had. But he had underestimated her. She turned the phone over so the screen was facing down. She already knew where she was going. A few days before the wedding, in a moment of hesitation she hadn't let herself examine too closely at the time, she had quietly renewed her job offer from the firm in Los Angeles. The position was still open. She had told them she wasn't sure, that she needed time. Now, she had made up her mind. Her flight boarded in 30 minutes. She had no baggage checked, no one to say goodbye to. She was walking into a life that was completely hers for the first time in years, and she had never felt more certain of anything. When she landed in L.A., the sun was already hanging high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the palm trees that lined the airport exit. The air was warmer, drier than the East Coast air she had left behind, but it carried something else with it. Possibility. She took a cab straight to the apartment she had booked for the first few months. It was small, modest compared to the luxury she had been surrounded by with Todd, but it felt right. The kind of place where she could breathe. For the next few days, she did nothing but exist. She went on long walks with no destination in mind. She sat in coffee shops, listening to the hum of strangers' conversations, letting herself fade into the background of a world that wasn't watching her, wasn't expecting anything from her. She spent hours reading, something she hadn't done in months, maybe longer. She let herself wake up without a plan, without obligations, without answering to anyone. The first time she laughed, truly, freely laughed, it caught her off guard. She had been on the phone with Nina, who had called the moment she realized Aisha was gone for good. "So, let me get this straight," Nina said, her voice crackling slightly through the speaker. "You just left in the middle of your damn honeymoon? Like, you just walked out?" Aisha grinned. "Technically, I took a cab." "Oh my God, you're a legend." Aisha laughed, and it felt different than before. Lighter. Like it wasn't weighed down by the pressure of being polite, of being proper, of being what was expected. Like she had finally let go of the performance. She didn't check her phone for messages from Todd anymore. She knew he had stopped trying eventually. She wondered what story he had told his family, how he had spun it to make himself look like the victim. Maybe he had said she was unstable, that she had cracked under the pressure of marriage. Maybe he had said nothing at all, letting their silence fill in the gaps. It didn't matter. She was done living for other people's narratives. The realization hit her one morning as she sat by the ocean, the waves rolling in and out in a steady, unhurried rhythm. She wasn't sad. She wasn't heartbroken. She wasn't even angry anymore. She was free. For so long, she had measured her worth by how well she fit into other people's lives, how much she could prove herself, how much she could earn their love and acceptance. But love wasn't something to be earned. It wasn't something that came with conditions, with unspoken expectations, with the constant need to be enough for someone else's world. Todd hadn't loved her. Not really, but that wasn't her failure. That was his. She watched the waves crash against the shore, breathing in the salty air, feeling the sun warm her skin. She had thought her wedding day would be the start of a new life. She had been right. She just hadn't realized back then that the life she was meant to live had nothing to do with Todd at all. She smiled to herself, the future stretching out before her, wide open and waiting. This was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and keep watching for more great content. And don't forget to share this video with others.